Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along to this webinar from still to sparkling, which is to take a look at where we are with our bottle weight accord, and specifically an update on some of the practice that we've had with bottle weight over the last few months, but also to begin to showcase some of the stuff we're finding in relation to sparkling wine bottles. Now, as we've always said with the bottle weight accord, obviously at heart it's a commitment by the participants in it to reduce their average bottle weight to below 420 grams by the end of 2026. But within that, almost more important is the lesson learning that we can do along the way, because part of what we see our role as SWR as being to do is to share best practice, to share shared experiences of making change happen. So what we're doing with this webinar is two things. First of all, to look at the sorts of activities and the sorts of actions that participants are having to undertake in order to weight their bottles. But also what's been quite interesting along the way in doing that, there's some sort of quite interesting insights into different aspects of, for example, consumer perception around lightweight bottles. So that's the first part of what we're going to be doing this afternoon. The second half is to flag up where we've got to so far in relation to sparkling wine bottle weight. Obviously, the original bottle weight accord, which we launched at the end of 2023, applies to still wines and 750 ml bottles. But we are now doing the work, or in the process of the work, to look at what might an equivalent accord look like for sparkling wine, which, as you will find out when we talk about it later, is a bit more of a complicated animal. To begin today's occasion, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Delaney, who's going to talk you through some of the lessons and the findings and the insights from the bottle weight accord over the last few months. Over to you, Delaney.
All right. Thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. So as Peter was teeing up, over the past 6 months particularly, but I mean over the whole Accord's lifespan, we've seen some real momentum, which is quite exciting. What really started just as an industry commitment is now starting to drive some tangible, measurable change. So for those of you who aren't already familiar, which I'm sure most of you will be, anything up to 50% of a wine's carbon footprint comes from the bottle alone, making it one of the biggest levers for impact on the carbon front in the wine industry. So 2 years ago, we conducted research to better understand the constraints around lightweighting, looking closely at key barriers like consumer perception, managing bottles in existing supply chains, those sorts of things. And the conclusion was pretty clear. For still wine, there's no need for bottles to weigh more than 420 grams. And that's what became the insight or the foundational insight for the bottle weight accord, which, as stated, is a industry commitment to bring down the average bottle weight of 750 milliliter still wines to below 420 grams by the end of 2026. Since then, the Accord has brought together signatories from all across the value chain, producers, distributors, and retailers, all working together to make bottle lightweighting the new industry standard. So just to take a quick look at who those signatories are, um, as I said, it brings together a real diverse mix of companies from across the wine value chain, stretching from the US and South America to Europe, the UK, Australia. We've got producers like Conchi Toro, the Catena Institute of Wine and Botanical Wines, as well as retailers like Whole Foods, the Wine Society, and Waitrose, and the Nordic alcohol monopolies. But we're also working with groups like Terravitas, who have actually embedded the bottle weight accord into their sustainability standard, which is quite exciting to see. So, where are we now with the accord? There are approximately 2 billion bottles under the accord, and in its first year, it mitigated 144,000 and change tons of carbon emissions. For reference, this is equivalent to approximately 18,000 households, which is, small town. For our UK-based audience, extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is front of mind and with good reason. So we ran the numbers, and after its first year, the Accord had already removed 119,000 tons of glass from the supply chain, which at 2024 EPR rates is equivalent to 28.5 million pounds in avoided fees, which is a clear demonstration that lightweighting also makes commercial sense. But just as important as those figures and the numbers are the stories behind them. So what's been really remarkable to see is how signatories aren't just meeting the challenge of lightweighting and showing some clear progress, but also going further, trialing lightweight bottles that go all the way down to 300 grams in their operations, conducting consumer research studies and surveys, launching educational campaigns, leveraging data, and working collaboratively with their supply chains and their supplier base to, again, further drive meaningful change. So, for this little 6 month update, we want to take a moment to spotlight just a few examples that illustrate that kind of work being done under the Accord, and reflecting that broader effort and creativity that we're seeing from signatories. So, starting with what consumers think. One of the most commonly cited barriers to lightweighting wine bottles is consumer perception, the idea that lighter bottles might be seen or feel like lower quality. So, to dig into that a little bit deeper, two signatories commissioned research this year, survey-based research, looking into understanding how consumers actually think about sustainable packaging. And I think the insights are quite interesting and quite compelling. So, first up, we have Boutineau, who ran a again, survey in the UK. And they asked one of the questions that they asked consumers was, what's the most important factor to you when you're buying wine? And the top three weren't surprising to me, and I don't think they'll be surprising to many. Taste, price, grape variety come out on top. But bottle weight was just under 0.5%, which, it suggests bottle weight isn't very high in front of mind for consumers when they're in the decision-making process. It might influence the subtle experience of, picking up a bottle on a shelf, but it's clearly not really front of mind when they're choosing what to buy. But if we hop across the pond and we look at Whole Foods, they ran a broader study looking at packaging preferences across all beverages with their customers. And while it's not wine specific, the findings I think still offer quite useful insights. So, packaging made from recycled materials ranked highest among packaging attributes, which held steady across both years of the study from 2023 to 4, at about 50% of shoppers identifying it as important. While a smaller share of consumers prioritize lightweight packaging and low carbon footprint, both of those attributes should increase year on year, which could suggest a growing awareness and interest in more environmentally responsible packaging, even if it's not yet a top priority for most shoppers. But interestingly, the study also noted how the trend appears stronger with younger generations, more prioritizing environmentally friendly attributes in general. But they also found that consumers continue to value sustainability, but not at the expense of price and practicality. But this points to an interesting and important takeaway, I think, that consumers are looking for sustainability to be integrated into the packaging so it still feels functional, attractive, and easy to use, which is exactly where lightweight glass bottles offer a really compelling opportunity. They retain that look, the feel, the familiarity of traditional packaging while delivering real sustainability advantages. I mean, less glass, lower emissions, reduced transport weight, which is where education and awareness jumps in. So, at a recent trade tasting, Boutineau ran a little display comparing two bottles of different weights. One of their longstanding producers had recently transitioned their Amarone in a classic Centinato bottle. I think I'm getting that right, from 600 grams down to 400 grams. And you can see this in the picture on the slide here. Seeing the two bottles side by side made that point pretty clear that there wasn't a really strong visual compromise in quality. In fact, they actually had many of their restaurant customers commenting, saying they preferred the lighter weight molds for service, um, which I found, again, quite compelling. Meanwhile, Catena Zapata and the Institute more broadly has taken also a quite proactive approach, launching an educational campaign with a QR code and quiz, which some of you may have seen at trade events this year. I know I personally did, I took it. The quiz challenges some common assumptions by asking what's the average bottle weight across the industry, what contributes most to wine's carbon footprint, and if people knew what the average weight of Catena's own bottles were, which I think is a smart and interactive way to engage both consumers and the trade and help shift those perceptions over time. importantly, it's just bringing the issue front of mind for people. And I think we're seeing a lot of progress over that, especially this year and a bit into last year. So data collection has been a big challenge for many signatories, especially those working with a wide network of suppliers. But when it's done well, it can become a really powerful tool for driving progress. And Direct Wines or Laithwaites has been doing exactly that, using their internal data to uncover where real reductions can be made across their range. They slice the data by SKU, country, brand, bottle weight, obviously, which it offers some really strategic insights on how they actually went about approaching the lightweighting. But just a few kind of headline figures to start off with. 65% of Laithwaite's volume are already in bottles that are 420 grams or less. Their lightest bottle in use is 300 grams, and they're not actually seeing any major breakages in deliveries, despite some initial concerns. But some of the things that helped them get there were using data analytics tools. So using things like scatter plots, where they're mapping bottle weight against sales volume, which helps give a really clear representation of their full assortment. You can flag outliers, and you can spot opportunities to reduce weight, especially in that mid-weight range, mid-weight and high volume, where the impact for light weighting and reduction is potentially greater. So to cap off this little bit, I wanted to celebrate some progress. And while the work is continued, there have been some pretty impressive achievements already. A number of signatories have already reached the 420-gram target ahead of schedule, which, with focus and collaboration, it shows that lightweighting at scale is absolutely achievable. So Tesco, for example, reached an average bottle weight of 410 grams across its range. As of March this year, um, which they removed 300 tons of glass from their supply chain, which is an insane accomplishment. Um, Another key part of that success came through close collaboration with Concha y Toro, which is another signatory of the Accord. And together they worked to align packaging specifications to reduce bottle weight in line with the target set out from the Accord. Another opportunity to celebrate is with Naked Wines USA. They also hit an average of 410 grams across their portfolio, and they attribute some of this to a major shift in standardizing their Burgundy and Bordeaux bottle molds, both which float around 396 grams. Um, that change, those two molds exclusively cover about 75% of their total production. And even when you factor in the other 25%, they're still at 410 grams across the range, which is very exciting. So again, this is really just to put a snapshot forward of some of the exciting and proactive work that's happening under the Accord. Signatories are showing that, with commitment and creativity and real engagement, that we can really be delivering the environmental impact and also, showing commercial results. So as always, if you're interested in learning more about the Accord or joining this group of industry leaders, please reach out to us. We'd love to speak to you. But with that, I will hand over to Peter to walk us through what's next, where we're taking this momentum forward with sparkling wines. So
Cool.
over to
Thank
you,
you.
Peter.
Thanks, Lainey. Just like to say, if anyone has any questions, you can either ask now about what we've been doing with Still over the last few months, or you can wait till the end, where we shall wait with bated breath for any questions then. I actually can't actually see you, so if anyone has questions, let me know. If not, we will crack on and take questions at the end. Okay, so today's sort of updated you all on where we are with the main bottle weight accord, which we've had in place now for 18 months. And that was always intended as a starting point to a much larger process of policy formulation around the whole question of packaging and wine. And the next stage in that journey is looking at sparkling wines. Um, it's a significant proportion of glass bottle use. Sparkling wines are one of the few areas within wine that is actually growing as a market segment. And obviously, because sparkling wine bottles are heavier, therefore the impact of that they have in terms of their carbon footprint is pronounced. At the moment, what's been really quite interesting about this research so far is really how little insight there is. I mean, there wasn't a great deal when it came to still wine, but there was still a decent amount. Whereas when it comes to sparkling wine, there really is very little out there. So we are in a position as an organisation where we can shape global best practice, because what we produce will be the first definitive analysis of sparkling wine bottle weight. And there isn't any clear industry standard. The weights are really all over the place. So really our goal, as the slide said, is to provide an evidence-based guidance for safe, practical lightweighting. And again, as with the work that we did 2 years ago in relation to still wine bottles, our role as an organization is to come up with that evidence-based insight that can drive action, in this case, in the space of sparkling wine. Next one, please, Delaney. It's interesting what Delaney was talking about just now in terms of consumer perceptions. It's become clear the more I've looked into that, we've looked into this is a question, that there's a lot more about what the industry thinks consumers think rather than what we actually know consumers to think. There are still people in the industry that will say, well, heavier bottles, consumers think that means better quality wine. Well, no, not necessarily. It does in certain demographics, it does in certain countries. But to say it's the defining factor is really simply not evidence backed. And some of those insights we're getting from people like Bruno Catena Zapata, Direct Wines, in terms of what and Whole Foods Market, in terms of what consumers actually think when asked, is really quite insightful. And what we found in the space of sparkling wine is there's very little insight at all, and that therefore, really, it's up to us as an industry to write on that space what we will. And perhaps the most interesting potential, and again, this is very much a work in progress, so watch this space for the final report. That younger consumers are less attached to heavy bottles. Older consumers tend to expect, or no, the word tend, not will, tend to expect their sparkling wines to come in heavier bottles. That's not an association younger consumers make. Younger consumers will be more inclined to say that sustainability is a factor that is important to them. So potentially that offers a real opportunity to non-champagne traditional method wines to be able to say, look, well, we're the same production method as champagne, but we're in a more sustainable packaging. So there's some real opportunities, I think, to write the agenda rather than feel it's being set by really tropes about what consumers really do think. As Delaney was saying in relation to the still wines, there's all to play for here. So I think there's a lot we can do in this space. Next slide, please. But obviously, the simplicity, although nothing is quite this simple when it comes to sustainability, the simplicity about the main bottle weight called for still sparkling wine is it was possible to set one target weight, average below 420 by the end of 2026. Obviously, sparkling wine is more complicated, and it's more complicated than we thought it was complicated when we started, because obviously the obvious factor when it comes to sparkling wines is the fact that it's a pressured liquid. So we thought, well, okay, well, let's just have a look at what we might be able to do about different bar pressures. But even that doesn't really answer the whole question because those bar pressures can vary at different points in that wine's life. Say, for example, say Charmat method wines might be, 3.5, 4 bar of pressure when they're sitting in the bottle, but they'll be bottled at a much higher pressure, so you don't get overfill. If wines are stored improperly and are subject to lots of heat, the curve between a wine pressure at 20 degrees and that wine pressure at 30 degrees is quite significant. There are also a number of factors around, particularly with non well, actually, with traditional method wines, that many of them, not just champagne, require maturation processes for a number of months or years in order that those wines can qualify for the relevant DOC or appellation branding. And that will obviously require long-term stacking for lees aging. Although very few wineries still use manual riddling, some still do. There is also the use of the Giro palette. And then also when you are stacking wines, it's not just a question of the outward pressure of the liquid in the bottle, but it's the inward pressure on that bottle caused by the stacking process. So there's quite a lot of variability to take into account. At the same time, if we tried to come up with a target sparkling bottle weight for pretty much any appellation of sparkling wine, then we'd be on the road to madness because we do need to come up with recommendations that are clear, straightforward, and critically actionable. What we always say about all of our work is it's got to be clear evidence that can lead to clear, transparent, logical action. So where we are heading is towards there being four broad categories of sparkling wines. Lightly sparkling wine, so that's probably roughly below, not probably, that's below three-ish bar wine pressure. So that will be things like Frisantes, Petnat, and so on. Then you have by far and away the largest chunk of the market, which is tank fermented wine, Charmat methods. And obviously the most obvious of that is Prosecco, but by no means the only one. Sect is produced in the same way. So that's the chunk of the market which I think we can probably make most action in. Then you have the traditional methods. You've got champagne, where the CIVC has made a clear stipulation that it feels the lightest bottle weight is 835 grams. That still provides quite a lot of scope for change because an awful lot of champagnes are still in bottles heavier than that. But then you have the other traditional method wines that are not champagne. So Clemence, Cavers, Franciacorta, things like that. Where again, you've got similar challenges in relation to champagne, but they're different because often the maturation periods are slightly less. Also, typically these wines tend to be, even now, in bottles lighter than champagne. So many sort of non-champagne traditional method are in bottles sort of high 700s. So there's definitely there's that's the categorization that seems to work reasonably well in terms of covering the key styles of wine, but also taking account of the various, in broad terms, the various factors. So pressure, fermentation, pressure if there's secondary fermentation, stacking, and so on. Next slide, please. But obviously, this issue of safety is absolutely critical. I mean, a number of the people I've interviewed so far have made it clear that they've got very bad memories of exploding bottles at various stages in the past, and any recommendations that we make need to be made in light of the idea that they are going to be safe. And I was talking to one or two of the companies I've been dealing with, and they're sort of saying that increasingly the focus on sustainability, or rather perceived focus on sustainability and lightweighting, can actually sometimes lead to requests being made for bottles that actually those bottles won't be fit for purpose. So we've got to make sure that whatever recommendations we make ensure that bottles are safe right from the point of manufacture. And I very pleased to have been to OI's plant down in Asti a couple of weeks ago to see their amazing operation there. So thanks very much to them for that. But it's not just from their production line; it's all the way through to those wines sitting in a customer's garden, at a drinks party, at a wedding or whatever. So the bottle has to be safe all the way through that process. And safety risks can stem from a number of issues, filling inconsistencies, how the closure works, microfactures doing handling, and so on. So those factors are material and important and will need to inform any recommendations that we make. However, there is also a very clear business case for lightweighting of sparkling wine bottles. Delaney's already shared the figure that were all the still wines that we've got under the main bottle weight accord to have been sold in the UK over the last year, they would have saved those companies 28.5 million pounds, which I think anyone would accept is a significant amount of money. And okay, that's only were they to have been sold in the UK, but increasingly we are seeing EPR-like regulations coming in other parts of Europe and parts of the US as well. So increasingly, and obviously companies are also being asked to respond to their scope 3 emissions. So increasingly, I think there's a real financial incentive as well as a sustainability one to lightweighting. And this is really driving our thinking about how to calibrate a sparkling wine accord. Because what we have with the still wine accord is an average below. Given the safety constraints, it would be unwise, I think, for us to say a weight below, because that might then compromise some of those safety characteristics. But at the same time, if we can point out or if we can identify a safe weight for a bottle, and the example we give here is there are, we know because we've seen them, some Prosecco producers that are using 570-gram bottles, have been for a while, have been doing it perfectly safely. We may come up with 600, but maybe 550, 570, but let's come back to that specific point when we come to the final report. But the fact is, if there are existing producers which are able to bottle and pack and supply wines in those lightweight bottles, frankly, anything else that's heavier than that is wasted glass. So identify examples of successful weighting in the real world. So if it works for, producers X, Y, and Z, it should work for others in the same style. So we will be setting target weights. Um, that will mean that there will be a direct cost liability for any bottles that are heavier than those target weights. And obviously from lightweight sparkling wines, it's the carbon cost and the cost savings in financial terms. However, riffing back to this question of safety, it's important that we provide within our eventual report an assessment of the various factors that need to be taken into account in order that that lighter weight bottle can be used. Um, that if we are going to be saying that there should be, for the sake of argument, a stipulation that prosecco style wines, Charmat wine should be in 570 or 600-gram bottles, that is given the caveat that other factors need to be taken into account to ensure that that will be a safe weight. Obviously, sugar levels within the wine need to be consistent because that is a direct correlation between the sugar level and the pressure. And obviously, that's a factor that's different where you have the secondary fermentation with traditional method wines. So that's the first factor. Secondly, filling level, so-called vacuity. So that's the gap between the top of the liquid and the bottle of the bottom of the closure. And that's effectively your pressure valve. So if you have inconsistency in how a bottle is filled, different bottles will have a different level of safety margin as they're used in use. So therefore, there needs to be a focus on um, visible, sustainable, and predictable filling use. Um, um, sort of slightly dotting around here, closures. It's not the closure per se, it's the fact that the insertion of a closure can cause microfractures and can cause damage to the bottle. Obviously, the process of inserting a cork is a stressful process. Bottles will have a thicker top of neck and a topper to ensure that they are stronger, but if that closure insertion process is not properly done, then potentially damage is caused to the bottle, and that will therefore potentially risk microfractures that could cause failure later on down the line. And then that goes to that point above, bottle handling. It's not just in the filling process, but the whole handling process, all the way from the point at which a bottle is made, all the way through to the bottle in which that bottle is used. It needs to be handled in such a way that microfractures do not become put into the bottle, and that therefore they are not going to have the risk of failure. This is also a factor also too with still wines. The recommendations we made within that report 2 years ago were around, for example, consistent use of, consistent speed in the filling line, because obviously stopping and starting causes bottles to joggle around and knock into each other. In making sure that handling tools are not metal, because that causes damage, but are plastic or nylon, factors like that. And obviously then handling in the onward supply chain, avoiding most obvious, avoiding excessive heat exposure, but again, ensuring that bottles are not subject to extreme stress and therefore causing more microfractures over time. So those will all be factors which we will need to reference in our report in order to be able to say, yeah, this is the target weight, but these are the factors that you'll need to be sure of to focus on in order to be able to make that reduction across the portfolio. So we're next, well, actually, it should have said June 25. This is what we're doing today. We're putting together, presenting our findings so far. The final report will be produced in August, and that will be a little like the report we produced on bottle weight 2 years ago. That will be the findings of the research process plus recommendations for action, which obviously will be a recommendation for a bottle weight accord. Probably at this stage, specifically in Charmat, but maybe also, slightly depending on what we're able to come up with around non-champagne traditional methods, but certainly on Charmat methods. And then we will launch a sparkling bottle weight accord at the main bottle weight accord's second birthday in November. So that's where we're going. Obviously, anyone that's got information or insight or knowledge that they can pass along and want to discuss, please do feed this in. We always say this, but it's true that we know nothing. We're only as good as the information we get from our members and from those people we talk to. So we're very lucky in this process to have a number of our retailers have been working with us very closely on this. We have the bottle making companies are members, and they've been incredibly helpful with the insights they've been able to provide. But obviously, anyone else that's able to provide insights or bits of information that you've been working on or analysis you've done, that would be incredibly helpful. So feel free to put it in. So that's all from me for the time being. So oh yes, full report. Read the full report, which I think is probably yes, there we go on the website. It's a cracking read. Download it, take it on your summer holiday, enjoy it. Right, that's all from me for the time being.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Well, then at this point, we'll want to open it up for Q&A. So we've got a Q&A box down below, but also a chat. So if you want to drop any questions you have in either box, Peter and I will sit and wait and in awkward silence.
Oh, there's one. Immediate.
All right.
This is the question is when did Teravitas embed the Accord in their certification? Um, it is in their certification. It's a requirement to have within the Teravita standard is a requirement to move bottles below 420 grams. And it must be said Teravitas were the first non-retailer to join the Accord. And I hope I'm not saying something they wouldn't want me to say when I say their argument was, well, it's the way in which the trajectory of travel is going. Therefore, they ought to be part of the process.
It's also
So
worth flagging that the lightweighting is one aspect of something they encourage in their packaging criteria, but they also encourage things like bottle reuse. So it's a decision that's up to certifying companies to pick between, are you going to lightweight your glass? Are you going to decide to do something that's reusable and redistributed or, that
yeah,
sort of thing?
no comment.
Actually, a
Another
point on that matter is we'll be coming around to our next round of benchmarking quite soon, in which Terravitas is a part of it. So keep an eye out for that coming shortly.
And just to answer the second half of Anne's question, those figures we used were global because our members are global. So it's not just UK. And they represent what happened between November 2023 and November 2024. So it's 1 year. And at the moment, those figures are only for still wines because at this stage, that's what the bottle weight accord covers. It doesn't cover sparkling at this stage, but obviously, as of the end of this year, it will.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne. So this was the naked wine figures were contributed in an update statement they provided for us, and they decided to include sparkling. So, but thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, but that means credit to you guys. That means you're well ahead of the curve. If your figures included sparkling, then good on you.
All right, we have a question from James.
When you say specifications, do you mean the technical specifications of the bottle, James, or are you just looking at um, the weight that we suggest? Um, if the former, we're not technically qualified to provide the technical specification of all the different factors that go into a bottle, um, because the number of factors that affect the structure of a bottle are myriad. I mean, obviously, the most obvious being the recipe, for want of a better term, of the glass that's used. So our number will be a target for styles of wine along um, those four categories that we provided earlier. And obviously, pressure is a key component of that. But it's not if one were to try and do just, as it were, resting pressures of different wines, that would not unfortunately tell the whole story. So, for the sake of argument, if we had recommendations of, I don't know, below three, 3 to 5, 6 to 7, 8, and above, that wouldn't necessarily cover all the variables because some wines, even if they are eventually at a lower pressure, the obvious one being Charmat method, they are sometimes at higher pressures because of in the case of Charlotte method, filling processes and or how they're then used within the supply chain. So it seems to make most sense to try and divide it by broadly by wine style. And again, this is really an attempt to try and find something that's doable, because we can't be in a situation where we have a different recommendation for each style of sparkling wine. So we're trying to group them into those spaces. Do
All
you think
right.
there's a key impact on brand perception and positioning based on? The answer to that, Stephanie, is no, not at all. It's very much the industry thinks that's the case, but all the evidence we're seeing, both from still and for now sparkling, is that no, not at all. It's brand people think it has an impact on brand perception. Consumers, frankly, don't, with the great respect, they don't seem to give a damn. Or rather, if you ask them a straight flight heavy bottle, well, actually, that's not even what Boudinot's found. People like the lighter bottle. Yes, there are certain demographics. China, for example, bits of California, Argentina, where there tends to be still an association between heavy bottles and better quality wine. But that's by no means universal. It's for a few demographics and few markets only, and there are myriad other factors that have a much greater impact. It might be bottle labels, it might be recommendations, it might be food matching, it might be what your mates have said. So there's all those other factors which come into play, and also as Delaney pointed out earlier, these are much less significant than the intrinsic values of the wine. What is it? What's the grape variety? What's the wine style? All of those issues are much, much more important. So if all we're doing, I'd say this slightly glibly, but it is also true. If a company maintains it needs to keep heavy bottles simply because its sales will tank otherwise, well, it just needs to get a decent marketing team. Yes, there are examples. For example, in Europe, there's a European retailer at the end of COVID ran out of bottles and put some of its wines in bag in box. And okay, that's a different question because that's a different format, but they saw sales fall. But generally speaking, the view seems to be, especially if you communicate to consumers, particularly if you communicate to consumers that lightweight bottles are more sustainable, then there's a real opportunity here, which I think the industry can really grab.
And I think that that also shows there's a sort of positive flip side to it as well, is that you could imagine situations where, especially with the younger demographic who's caring more and more about environmental, sustainability things in their decision making, if you're a wine brand who's making a big deal about the shift to lightweight and making that very known and making that a part of your branding as like an environmental thing, then you could see that having positive brand effects as well. And I think this is what Peter was picking up on earlier with the opportunity for sort of non-champagne traditional method wines. I mean, we certainly see it. You could look at Telmont in Champagne, who did make a big shift to a lighter weight bottle, and that's definitely tied to their brand ethos in terms of stewardship of the environment. So it doesn't. There could be some potential positive brand effects as well. I mean, it's not very well established, but in terms of the research, but this is observing market dynamics. All right. Well, those are some good questions. If you've got more, please feel free to drop them in. We've left plenty of time today for questions. So, okay, we've got one from Jonathan. How have bottle manufacturers adjusted pricing for lighter weight bottles? Does lighter weight imply greater technical/design/QA requirements, hence premium
Yeah.
price?
I mean, this is one of those questions which we get up quite a lot, that the logic being that lighter weight bottles use less glass, therefore should be cheaper. Unfortunately, like a lot of these things, it's not quite as simple as that, and that comes down to the manufacturing process. The molding process for a lighter weight bottle needs to be much more exact and exacting than for a heavyweight bottle. I mean, essentially, if you're using say, take still wines, if you're using a normal weight bottle around 550 grams, the amount of spare glass you've got, for want of a better way of putting it, within the body of that bottle means that it can cope with being abused. So even if it's thinnest point, the wall of the bottle is still thick enough to manage the pressures necessary. Whereas with lighter weight bottles, because you've physically got less glass to play with, the margins for error are lower. Therefore, the molding technique is much more complicated. And as I was visiting the LY plant in ASTI a couple of weeks ago. And the molding process includes a really very complicated process of blowing air into the first mold in order to spread that glass evenly, in order that it's got the right thickness of glass at the various points where it's going to need it. Because obviously, the glass doesn't need to be consistent thickness along the bottle. But the molding process makes that happen. And that process, plus the creation of the molds, is a more expensive process. It also means that the recipe, the glass itself, needs to be much more exacting. So it ends up being slightly six of one and a half dozen of the other. As far as we know, obviously we're not subject to the commercial deals between um, winemakers or producers and their bottle makers. But by and large, what seems to happen is that lightweight bottles end up being more or less the same price as heavyweight bottles. Obviously, the bottle makers save on the glass involved, but they've got all these other factors as well. Um, so slightly complicated techie answer, but I think that's broadly correct.
And
Thanks,
also
Jonathan.
just to
It's
say that
amazing. It's amazing what one gets to be an expert on doing this job.
if you're curious and learning a bit more about some of this, and in our initial report from 2023, Peter goes into some of the, manufacturing methods to make lighter weight bottles. So if you're curious, that report's up on our website and a lot of other great materials podcasts and articles to read through if you've got more questions on that front. All right, we've got another question.
Yes, now this is another very interesting one. Yes, basically is the short answer to that. And this comes back to this question about the recipe of the glass that's used. Obviously, glass is a viscous liquid. And in order to and you have up to eight ingredients, many of which are in tied, some of which do to with obviously the basic makeup of the material, others are to do with providing colors, but others are to do with what one might broadly term malleability, and the importance of making sure that that mixture works exactly as the bottle maker, the guy that's running the production line, needs it to how he needs it to work. Because coming back to my point about lighter weight bottles, less glass, therefore less margin for error, that also includes error around what is in that mixture. And if you have a very, very high recycled content, I mean, up to if you have the general view seems to up about to where 85% is possible. But anything higher than that, because you don't know what's in that cullet, you don't know what's in it. You don't know what other mixtures might be in it. And, I've seen bottles where you've got to kind of, because we consumers will sometimes chuck glass, the chinaware in our glass recycling. You sometimes get chunks of earthenware will come into cullet, which then finds its way into, looks like sort of, additions to the bottles. Because they don't know what's in the cullet, you're effectively, the bottle maker is effectively having to work with a substance that they don't know. So they require that kind of 15% minimum wiggle room to be able to make sure that they can add in um, the things that they will need to mean that that overall recipe will behave as they want it to. I mean, speaking as a cook, and I know Delaney will get this one as well, but it's a bit like if you're starting off with someone else's spaghetti bolognese. If it's you've got to take all of someone else's spaghetti bolognese, it's not going to work as your bolognese, but you can take quite a high proportion before you can add stuff in that's going to make it work for you, and that's the case with bottle weight. So that if you want um, lighter weight bottles, then there is, it seems to me, as far as I know, a limit to the amount of recycled content you can have. Obviously, that's all the more the case when you're dealing with flint glasses, so clear glasses, clear bottles, sorry, because obviously that is very difficult to get color because unless you've got 100% clear color, and again the recycling processes are sometimes not up to speed on that. It's very difficult to have a very high proportion of recycled in that. So again, a slightly longer term, a longer winded answer, but I hope that answers the question.
I love the idea of spag bowl lightweight bottles.
Yeah, sorry, I go
Fantastic
sideways into
analogy.
analogies. At least I didn't go into Latin in doing it, so there we go.
All right,
Um,
and a
well,
question
no,
from Mark.
Mark, again, the answer to that is we don't yet know because we've not done the work. Um, um, there is kind of mixed evidence from the limited but mixed. Um, the the mixed on the downside is that the example I mentioned just now, which is that one European producer was required because they ran out of bottles during lockdown to put some of their mainstream brands into bag in box, and the sales were hit. Um, so that there is that potential downside, but equally you are beginning to see um, good evidence where well presented and where the case is made well to consumers of people saying, "Oh, that's quite a good idea." And we were talking last week to Waitrose, and they've removed all their small format wines they put into cans, not small bottles. But they made the point to consumers it's more convenient. It's not going to spill as well, it's not spill as easily, and so on. So there are messages that can be made, and I think you're beginning to see also with cans the communication around with more health conscious drinking, the idea that you might want a drink in the middle of the week, and therefore you don't want to open a whole bottle, but therefore a single serve can is the right way forward. You're also seeing arguments, I mean, the Bogle aluminium bottle, and you see the same thing with PET. It's lighter weight, therefore, if you're going somewhere with your wine, it's easy to carry it. So I think there are messages that can be made, but that's not what this current research is about. We will be doing next year, or starting on it now, but we're working on our um, formats packaging tool, and that will start to look at consumer perceptions around some of these things.
It's also worth mentioning the Boutineau's research also looked a little bit into alternate packaging types as well. And they did ask consumers about formats or alternate formats they'd tried in the, past few months. And I think unsurprisingly, screw top glass and cork glass came out on top. But following that was bag and box or wine boxes, miniature wine bottles, and cans. Those are the top kind of three. I think speaking to what Peter mentioned earlier, the things like cans are really fit for purpose and fit for use. So I think that's a clear driver for acceptance. If you can see a clear kind of use case for it, it makes sense. But interestingly, when they contrasted it with, they also asked what consumers thought was the best type of packaging for the environment. They mentioned both glass bottles up top as well, a screw cap and cork, presumably for recyclability purposes. But the one that they thought from the alternate space that was the best was paper wine bottles. So things like the Frugal Pack bottle. So again, perhaps emulating something like a standard bottle. Anyway, like Peter mentioned, there's a lot more to come here and a lot more to unpack. So
Yeah.
keep your eyes out on
So,
this space.
Jonathan, you're on steam on fire today. Any stats on breakdown losses downstream distribution? Again, this is anecdotal because this sort of stuff doesn't get published. But many, if not all, of the producers and retailers that we've spoken to about still wine bottles is that they're using really very, in some cases, really very lightweight bottles without any real challenges. I mean, when I did the original bottle weight work 2 years ago, talking to a producer who is based down the Languedoc in South France, who said I've just been gradually reducing the weight of my bottles over the last 5 years, and no one's noticed. And and obviously, that if bottles were breaking, they get that feedback. Um, and again, that comes down to the fact that because lighter weight bottles are better engineered, the point being that because the walls are smoother, although they're thinner, the point is that they're no thinner than a traditional bottle would be at its thinnest point. All you're doing is you're avoiding the wastage of all the additional material that's in there. Obviously, when it comes to sparkling wines, that's why this whole safety issue is so important. Because obviously, if you did get significant breakage issues around that, there was a set of examples in the UK in the 2014, 2015. There have been cases since where there have been exploding bottles, and that tends to be something one finds out about it because it's in the popular press. So that's why when we make our eventual recommendations in relation to sparkling wine, we do need to be very cognizant of the fact of making those safety recommendations around vacuity, insertion of cork, handling, etc., because that will be key to making sure that those down the line issues will be negated or you know not occur at all.
All right. Well, we'll leave a couple more minutes for questions. Got some really great ones out there, so thank you to everyone who did submit. And then otherwise, we'll wrap up the session for today and let you get on with the rest of your day.
And thanks everyone for coming, and then thanks for the questions. It's really interesting to get those questions because it helps us understand where the interest is in terms of issues we need to make sure we've covered off, but also makes us think about, can we answer that? Do we know that? Oh, maybe we need to look at more. So thank you very much for the questions. It's much appreciated.
And also a big thank you to all of our Bottle Weighted Cord signatories, especially those who
Yeah,
contributed comments for this update. It's because of the fantastic work that they're actually doing and implementing that we're able to, claim progress on this. So a big round of applause to them. And thank you to everyone who came today. If you want to
excellent.
re-listen, the recording will be available after the fact. So thank you very much, everyone.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.